Welcome back to 101 East. New Zealand's Prime Minister Helen was and remains an outspoken critic of the US-led war in Iraq. With increasing speculation now about further US military action, this time against Iran, I asked her whether she agrees with America's growing hawkishness towards Iran. There was a research report that was leaked out of Washington only within the past few days, the conclusion of which is being reported as suggesting that Dick Cheney is now getting the upper hand over what has been the Condoleezza Rice position on Iran, i.e. the hawkish approach to taking action in Iran as a support for the Washington position. How can that fit in to the aims of the Alliance of Civilizations? How can that fit in to the idea of solving the problems in the Middle East?
Well, in the end, the American people are going to have to resolve that. They're going to have to resolve it through a political process. And we're in a very intense period in the US at the moment, and I don't really want to be a participant in that at all.
But do you have a fear that Iran is a target?
Well, I think, and the New Zealand government thinks, that there isn't a military solution to the problem posed by Iran. Let's put our cards on the table. New Zealand is the most upfront nuclear-free country in the world. We are, to the best of my knowledge, the only nation on earth that has passed legislation making our country nuclear-free. We have taken a position against all nuclear weapons, regardless of who holds them, and that's been our position for many, many years. Now, we lobby strongly against proliferation of nuclear weapons. So, of course, we have concerns when Iran is less than transparent as it has been. And we've been fully in support of the IAEA process.
But is it your position that Iran, is it your position that you believe Iran is in pursuit of nuclear weapons?
Well, we don't know that, but what we know is that Iran is less than transparent with the IAEA. And our request to Iran has always been, be transparent, play the game, so that you can be seen to be upholding your non-proliferation treaty commitments.
So, back to the issue of how then to deal with this. The hawkish approach to getting involved in Iran militarily would seem to be, at this moment, a strange one. Would you consider that to be rational, given how the Iraq adventure has played out?
The New Zealand approach is to pursue every diplomatic means. That was also our approach with Iraq, and it wasn't an approach in the end that was taken by larger and powerful friends, but our approach is to use diplomacy.
Your involvement in the Iraq-Afghanistan situation, two different sort of levels of engagement here. Clarify for us exactly how you would differentiate getting engaged in Afghanistan and stepping away from the Iraq action.
Well, it's a question of what is the considered judgment of the multilateral system. In the case of Afghanistan, the United Nations was very quick to react after September 11th in calling for various measures to be taken with respect to Afghanistan. And we got involved pursuant to that. Overwhelmingly, our involvement has been of the peace-building kind. We have had 3 deployments of special services at an earlier point of the issue. But these days it's largely in Bamiyan province, helping support the extension of the central government and development there. With respect to Iraq, of course, there was no multilateral consensus and no support from the Security Council for a war there, and we were not part of that. Subsequent to the war, the UN passed resolutions which called on people to support reconstruction, and that led to us for 1 year placing military engineers in the Basra area to help with reconstruction, but we didn't extend beyond that.
So your judgment, you've explained, of the difference between the situation in Afghanistan and the situation in Iraq. Where does that put you in this idea that the world is now engaged in a war on terror? What does that phrase mean to you? Well,
we don't use that phrase ourselves. Clearly there's an issue with terrorism, but terrorism won't be defeated by military means alone. It has had a role with respect to Afghanistan, but overwhelmingly terrorism will only be defeated by winning the war of ideas, if I could put it that way. And I think the war of ideas is best won if we accept, firstly, that there isn't a single set of ideas that should dominate all other ideas, but that plurality, diversity is part of the rich pattern of humankind. We need to find ways of living alongside each other and respecting each other's perspectives and views. I come back to the situation in New Zealand, which I don't pretend to be a perfect nation by any means, but what I know is that we have found ways of reconciling our differences, which have been quite profound going back to the time of colonisation. And we don't necessarily always reach agreement, but we find ways of respecting difference, and that's what I think the international community is crying out for.
Let's talk about that in a little bit more micro detail, if we can. The racial relationships within New Zealand and New Zealand's approach to immigration are in themselves an expression of everything that you said. How do you think you can maybe convey that sort of an approach to these issues to the rest of the world?
I think because we are seen to work hard at these issues ourselves, we have more credibility in expressing these views in an international setting, because people appreciate that New Zealand is saying offshore what it's attempting to practice onshore. So we don't have two levels of action, if you like, preaching offshore but not having clean hands at home.
Can I just bring up the Time magazine cover recently, which addressed one of those issues, and that is that the position of the Maoris and the rise, it seems, of violent gang culture amongst the Maoris. How troubling is that?
I think that article really is not particularly accurate. We have had ethnic-based gangs in New Zealand for quite a lot of years, and it's not a good development, and there were years when unemployment, particularly among Māori people, was far higher than it is today, and some of these gangs got quite established. I think the only way to break them down is by providing opportunity for young people to see careers outside the structure of a gang, and I'm confident that over time we can wear that down.
So you disagree with Time magazine, which said there's a brutal street gang culture that's defied authority for more than 30 years?
Tell me a country which doesn't have a gang or organised crime problem. I find it hard to think of one.
The mayor of Wanganui said that it's tripled in the past year alone. Is
No,
that?
I don't believe that.
You don't believe that?
No.
Let's talk for a minute about one of the other big issues of the day, and that's climate. Now, you have been fairly eloquent and spoken at length on climate issues, and yet I was interested to see Greenpeace in New Zealand accusing you of losing the plot only very recently, and suggesting that you've been trying to play down the effect of carbon dioxide emissions. How did that come about?
Goodness knows. That's Greenpeace. But what I would say is this, that we all have to make a huge effort on sustainability. The planet is creaking at the seams. We're testing the world ecosystems to the limits, and everybody has to be part of it. And one hopes with whatever happens post-2012 and the first Kyoto commitment period, that there will be a broader buy-in also from the large emerging developing economies, which are doing a lot of polluting, into some kind of framework where they accept a share of responsibility as well. As for New Zealand, we have been spinning wheels to try and get new policies in place which will enable us to be a credible player, and we can be.
Let me finish off then, if we could, with going back to the issue of the Alliance of Civilizations, and particularly this idea of the Middle East as being one of the key elements that needs to be solved for progress. You say New Zealand is a small country and its influence is limited, but I notice Forbes magazine has you in their top 20 most influential women in the world, so perhaps you're being a little modest on this. What would your advice be to solving the Middle East problem, the Palestine problem in particular? Do you see a first step that is absolutely necessary?
Well, the step has to be to get the two-state solution in place. Palestine has to be recognised as a state with its own secure borders next to Israel with its own secure borders. What really troubles me at the present time is that it having taken so long to make progress on that, that Palestine itself has fractured to the point where we talk about, in effect, civil war in Palestine, with now what appears to be a different administration in the Gaza as opposed to the West Bank. Now, I don't think anyone had in mind a three-state solution for the Israel-Palestinian crisis. So this is deeply troubling at this time.
Do you think the refusal of the EU and the US to recognise Hamas as a legitimate party in these negotiations had anything to do with the current situation?
I think the tremendous economic pressures on Palestine have been underlying the political crisis. It's almost impossible for those of us who live in affluence in the West to understand how Palestine has even been able to keep going, and I suspect it's only been because of remittances from the very large expatriate community.
Can you understand or explain why it is that those economic pressures are being imposed quite so fearsomely?
Well, that's because of a diplomatic position which others have taken, and I really don't want to engage on the wisdom or otherwise of that, but the results are clear that you squeeze the lemon till the pips come out, and the result has been a pretty desperate situation.
Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Nice. Thanks.